The first bullet tore through Ezra Blackwood's shoulder before he even heard the gunshot. The second ripped through his side, just below his ribs, spinning him sideways. The third grazed his skull, sending his vision into a kaleidoscope of white-hot pain and encroaching darkness. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the 6-year-old boy trembling beneath his body, still breathing, still alive, because Ezra had thrown himself between the child and death itself. The living room of the Volkov mansion had transformed into a war zone in less than 30 seconds. Smoke grenades hissed toxic clouds across Italian marble floors. Shattered glass from exploded windows glittered like deadly diamonds in the afternoon light. For men dressed in black tactical gear, faces masked, moved with military precision through the chaos, automatic weapons trained on anything that still moved. Ezra had seen the danger 60 seconds before it arrived. He'd been in the kitchen preparing afternoon tea when something in his gut twisted, a familiar recognition, a dread he hadn't felt since West Virginia, since the night his father's blood had pooled on their porch floor while lone shark stood over his broken body. The delivery truck parked across the street for 2 hours. The gardener who hadn't shown up for work. The almost imperceptible blind spot in the security camera coverage he'd noticed that morning while dusting the monitors. His father's voice echoed through his fading consciousness. Learn to see danger before it sees you, Ezra. That's the only way you survive in our world. He had survived West Virginia. He had survived losing everything. He had survived 8 months of invisible servitude in this cold New York mansion. He was nothing more than a help, a small-town omega from nowhere, scrubbing floors and raising a child who wasn't his, while sending 70% of his meager paycheck back to his 17-year-old sister, Amelia. But surviving had taught him to recognize the signature of violence. And when those windows exploded inward, his body had moved on pure instinct. The boy beneath him, Mateo Volkov, was sobbing against his chest, his small hands clutching Ezra's uniform as if Ezra were the only solid thing left in the universe. Blood soaked through the fabric. His blood, spreading in warm rivulets that he could feel, but somehow couldn't process. The pain was distant now, replaced by a strange floating sensation he recognized from his nursing school days. Shock, blood loss, organ damage. He was dying. Through the veil of toxic smoke and the deafening crack of gunfire, the steel-cold gray eyes of Damien Volkov swept across the living room as it drowned in chaos. They called him the Iron Wolf, the lord of New York's underworld empire, the man who ran half the city with an iron fist and a bottomless cruelty. An alpha in every sense of the word, dominant, ruthless, untouchable. In 38 years of life, Damien had never known what fear was. He had watched his father get assassinated right in front of him without shedding a single tear. He had buried his husband with a face still cold as stone. But the moment his gaze found Ezra Blackwood lying motionless on the floor, blood spreading into a red pool beneath him, something inside his chest tightened in a way he couldn't explain. 3 shots rang out in quick succession from the Beretta in Damien's hand. 3 assassins hit the floor before they could even swing their barrels toward him. No hesitation. No blink. Only the lethal precision of a man who had killed more than his years. The 4th assassin tried to lunge for the shattered window, but Damien was faster. He grabbed the back of the man's neck, twisted hard, and the sound of bones snapping cracked dry through the air. The body crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. Damien's expression didn't change, still as cold and detached as if he were handling a tedious chore. In the 8 months Ezra had worked in this mansion, Damien had looked at him only twice. The first time was the day he arrived, when Damien asked his name and forgot it immediately, because to him, Ezra was just one of dozens of nameless servants passing through his life. The second time was 2 hours before the bullets tore through his body. Damien had been walking down the hallway when he saw Ezra sitting there reading to Mateo, his voice gentle and warm in a way this cold mansion had been missing for far too long. He had stopped, truly looked at him, and asked how long he'd been taking care of his son. Ezra had lifted his head, hazel eyes meeting gray, and answered softly, 8 months, sir. 8 months. And now he was dying because of Damien's son. Damien lunged toward Ezra, his knees sliding across the marble floor slick with blood. He pulled the Omega away from Mateo as gently as he could, passing the boy into the arms of Marco, who had just come running in. His hands were shaking. For the first time in 38 years, those hands that had squeezed a trigger more times than he could count trembled beyond control. He pressed his palm to the wound in Ezra's back, trying to stop the blood that wouldn't stop pouring out. But there was too much blood. Far too much. It spilled through the gaps between his fingers, hot and slippery, as if Ezra's life were draining away right in front of him. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do. No, no, stay with me, stay with me. His voice broke, rough and raw, in a way that even he didn't recognize as his own. Ezra's eyes fluttered half open, glassy, yet they still found his through the fog of death drawing near. He whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. The boy, is he safe? Yes, because of you. God, because of you. Ezra's hand rose, trembling, and touched his face. Those fingers, icy and soaked in blood, brushed along his cheek in a way no one had dared touch Damien Volkov for the past 3 years. And he smiled, a smile so faint, so sincere it hurt to look at. You remembered my name. Then the darkness swallowed him. The wail of an ambulance siren tore through the night, settling over New York. Paramedics rushed into the Volkov mansion with a stretcher, but when they moved to load Ezra into the vehicle, Damien stopped them with a look as cold as ice. I'm going with him. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order that couldn't be argued with. A young paramedic started to protest, but Marco grabbed him and pulled him back, whispering a few words into his ear. The paramedic's face drained of color when he realized who he had almost dared to defy. Damien carried Mateo into the ambulance, then set the boy down on the seat beside Ezra's gurney. Father and son were both smeared with his blood. Damien's $10,000 suit was now nothing more than fabric soaked through with red, and Mateo's pajamas were blotched like a nightmare painted in stains. The 6-year-old screamed and sobbed, his voice gone hoarse from too much shouting, tears streaming down his chubby cheeks where streaks of blood still clung. Save him, Daddy. He saved me. You have to save him. Damien pulled his son into his arms. One arm wrapped around Mateo, the other reaching for Ezra's ice-cold hand. He was still unconscious, an oxygen mask covering half his pale face, blood still seeping through the temporary bandage the paramedics had rushed to wrap around him. Damien's thumb traced small circles over the back of his hand without thinking, a gentle gesture he hadn't made for anyone since Sergei was laid into the ground 3 years ago. He didn't even realize he was doing it. He only knew he couldn't let go of him, as if some invisible tether had hooked into his ribs and held him there, forcing him to anchor this Omega to this world at any cost. I will save him, he whispered into Mateo's hair, damp with sweat and tears. I swear on my life. 15 minutes later, the convoy surged into the emergency bay at Mount Sinai. With a single call from Marco, the hospital's full resources were mobilized. The best surgical team was summoned on an emergency basis. The best operating room was made ready. No one asked why, and no one dared to. The name Volkov carried more weight than any emergency order. Ezra was rushed into surgery. The doors slammed shut, and Damien stood there in the brightly lit sterile corridor, his expensive suit stained with blood that had dried into dark brown. He looked like a statue, motionless, his face empty, but those gray eyes stayed locked on the operating room doors as if he could see straight through them. Mateo had fallen asleep in the arms of Mrs. Rosa, brought in by Marco, but even in sleep the boy still whimpered, calling Ezra's name. 3 hours passed, then 4. Finally, the operating room doors opened, and the chief surgeon stepped out with a tired face. He looked at Damien, then drew a deep breath before he spoke. The surgery is over. But he lost a lot of blood. Severe internal organ damage. There's a 60% chance he won't make it through the night. Damien's jaw clenched, a vein standing out at his temple. Then you'd better be in the other 40%. Because if he dies, everyone in this building is going to die with him. 3 days passed like 3 years. Ezra lay motionless in a hospital bed, his skin so pale it nearly blended into the white of the sheets. The 4 lines and the heart monitor were the only things proving he was still alive. Damien didn't leave the hospital for even one step. He refused to go home and change his clothes, refused to eat a proper meal, refused every emergency meeting the capo regime kept demanding. Marco brought him a clean suit, but it stayed in the bag unopened. New York's Iron Wolf now sat on the hard chair in the VIP room, stubble rough along his jaw, eyes hollow from lack of sleep, and his gaze never once left the face of the Omega in a coma in front of him. Mateo refused to go home, too. The 6-year-old curled up on the sofa beside Ezra's bed, clutching the worn teddy bear Ezra had given him on his birthday, his lips murmuring his name even in sleep. Every time he woke, the first thing he asked was always the same: "Has Mr. Ezra woken up yet, Daddy?" And every time, Damien could only shake his head, his throat tightening until no words would come. On the second night, Marco came with the investigation results. He stood in the corner of the room, lowering his voice so he wouldn't disturb Mateo asleep nearby. 3 of the 4 assassins had been identified, all of them former military mercenaries, the kind of expensive professionals not just anyone could hire. Someone had paid an enormous sum for this hit. And worse, that person knew Mateo's schedule, knew exactly when the boy would be home alone with only the Omega Maid. That could mean only one thing: there was a mole inside the organization. Marco paused, watching his boss. In 15 years at Damien Volkov's side, he'd seen this man face countless enemies, survive bloody wars, bury his father and his husband without ever breaking. But never, not once, had Marco seen Damien like this. This wasn't the anger Marco knew, not the familiar cold fury of the Iron Wolf. This was fear. Real fear. The kind Marco had believed Damien Volkov wasn't capable of feeling. After Marco left, Damien took out the file he'd ordered on Ezra Blackwood. He read it page by page under the dim light of the hospital room, and every line felt like a blade carving into his chest. Ezra came from a poor little town in West Virginia, a place where hope was a luxury and the future was a concept that didn't exist. His family broke apart when he was 10. His mother vanished without a single goodbye. His father was addicted to alcohol and gambling, and when Ezra was 16, loan sharks beat him to death right on the front porch over a debt he could never have paid. He saw all of it. After that, Ezra raised his younger sister Amelia alone, taking whatever work he could to bring in money. He'd studied nursing for 2 years, top of his class, but had to drop out because he couldn't afford the tuition. He came to New York looking for work, and for the past 8 months, 70% of his meager pay had been sent back to Amelia so the girl could stay in school. So at least one of the 2 siblings might have a chance to escape the spiral of poverty. Damien closed the file, set it on the table, then looked at Ezra lying there still and silent. He had nothing. No money, no power, no one to protect him. He was just a small Omega from a nameless town, trying to survive in a world that had taken everything from him. And yet he had thrown his body in front of 3 bullets for his son, a child who didn't share his blood, a family that wasn't his. Damien leaned down, rested his elbows on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in years, his voice trembled when he whispered, "Why did you do it? You don't even know us. Why would you die for my son?" There was no answer. Only the steady beep of the heart monitor and Ezra's breath, so light it barely seemed there. Then, on the 3rd night, as Damien slumped against the bed in a broken half-sleep, a faint movement jolted him awake. Ezra's eyelids fluttered, slowly opening. His hazel eyes were cloudy with medication and exhaustion, but still alive. His lips moved, his voice so weak it was almost impossible to hear. "Mateo, is the boy okay?" Damien stared at him as if he'd just performed a miracle. "You almost died for my son, and the first thing you ask is whether he's okay?" Ezra's lips curved into the faintest smile. "He's just a child." He didn't ask for any of this. Something cracked open in Damien's chest. Something he'd thought died with Sergei 3 years ago. He reached out and took Ezra's hand, that same cold, fragile hand, and held it between both of his. "You're going to be fine," he said, and for the first time he wasn't sure if he was saying it for Ezra or for himself. "I won't let anything happen to you." A week had passed since the night Ezra opened his eyes. His body recovered slowly but steadily, enough for the doctors to allow him to be discharged on the condition that he be cared for and monitored carefully. Damien brought him back to the Volkov mansion, but not to the small room in the servants' quarters where he'd lived for the past 8 months. Instead, Ezra was taken to a VIP room in the east wing of the estate, right next to Mateo's bedroom. It was 5 times the size of his old room, with a king-size bed, Egyptian silk sheets, and tall windows looking out over the rose garden. Ezra wanted to protest, to say he was only a maid and didn't deserve this kind of treatment. But one look from Damien silenced him. It wasn't the look of an employer handing out charity. It was the look of an alpha who didn't accept refusal. On the afternoon of the 3rd day after he returned, Mrs. Rosa brought Ezra a steaming bowl of chicken soup. The elderly housekeeper had worked for the Volkov family for more than 30 years, her face lined with age, but her eyes still sharp and kind. She sat beside Ezra's bed and watched him eat with a tenderness Ezra hadn't received from anyone since his father died. "You know," Mrs. Rosa said, her voice dropping as if she were sharing a secret, "Mr. Damien hasn't always been this cold. Before Mr. Sergei died, he was different. Still strict, but he could laugh." Ezra looked up, his spoon pausing halfway. "Mr. Sergei?" "Mr. Damien's late husband." Mrs. Rosa sighed. "He died in a car accident 3 years ago. His car went over a cliff on a deserted mountain road." She hesitated, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "But a lot of people believe it wasn't an accident." Mr. Damien changed completely after that. Colder. Harder. As if he buried his heart right along with Mr. Sergei. Before Ezra could ask anything more, the door swung open without a single knock. A man stepped in, and the air in the room seemed to turn to ice. He was tall and lean, with jet black hair spilling across his forehead and flawless pale skin. An expensive red suit clung to his perfect figure, and the faint scent of expensive cologne drifted through the room. He was beautiful, beautiful in a cold, dangerous way, like a venomous snake wrapped in the most dazzling skin. But it was his eyes that made Ezra's skin prickle, ice cold, sharp as blades, and filled with contempt as they looked down at him in a bed. Mrs. Rosa sprang to her feet, her face tight. "Mr. Valentine, I didn't know you were coming." Valentine flicked a hand without even looking at the housekeeper. "Leave. I want to speak privately with this little Omega." Mrs. Rosa cast Ezra a worried glance, but she didn't dare argue. She stepped out in silence and closed the door behind her. Valentine Blackwell moved closer, his gaze traveling from Ezra's head to his feet with undisguised disdain. "So you're the little Omega everyone in the city's been talking about." His voice was sweet, but it dripped with poison. Ezra didn't know who he was, but the survival instinct sharpened by years in West Virginia were screaming. This man was dangerous. Extremely dangerous. "Don't think you're special just because you took a few bullets," Valentine sneered. "Omega is like you come and go in Damien's world. You're just a number, a passing face he'll forget in a few weeks." Ezra held his stare without blinking, without trembling. Years of facing loan sharks and surviving hell had taught him one thing. Never let anyone see you're afraid. "And yet I'm still here," he said evenly, "in his house in the room right next to his son." "Where are you, Mr. Blackwell?" Valentine's face went pale for a split second, his eyes flashing with anger before he could hide it. He turned and walked toward the door, but paused in the doorway and looked back with a smile as cold as ice. "Enjoy it while you can. Omega is like you don't survive in our world." Ezra didn't flinch. His voice was steady as stone. "Omegas like me are the only ones who do." 2 days after the confrontation with Valentine, Ezra received a message from Mrs. Rosa saying that Damien wanted to see him in his office. He walked the long hallway of the mansion, his heart beating faster than usual without knowing why. Maybe because his meeting with Valentine still haunted him, those sweetly spoken threats still echoing in his ears like a curse. The heavy oak door opened, and Ezra stepped into a room he'd never set foot in during his 8 months of work here. Damien Volkov's office was dark and unmistakably masculine, with bookshelves rising to the ceiling, a gleaming black oak desk, and a faint scent of whiskey in the air. Late afternoon light slipped through the thick velvet curtains, painting pale gold streaks across the wooden floor. Damien stood with his back to him, facing the large window, his tall frame a dark silhouette against the sky turning orange-red. He didn't turn when Ezra entered, but his low voice carried through the quiet room. "Close the door." Ezra did, then stood there waiting. Silence stretched for a few seconds, heavy and tight, before Damien spoke again, still without turning. "Marry me." Ezra thought he'd heard wrong. He blinked, trying to process what had just reached his ears. "I'm sorry. Marry me?" Damien finally turned, gray eyes meeting hazel. "Not for love. For survival." Ezra stood there, his mouth slightly open in shock, unable to believe what he'd just heard. Him, a penniless Omega from West Virginia, and Damien, the most powerful alpha mafia boss in New York, getting married. The idea was so insane he almost laughed. But Damien's expression was completely serious, not a trace of a joke. He walked to the desk, poured a glass of whiskey, but didn't drink it, only held it as if he needed something solid to grip. "The traitor inside my organization still hasn't shown his face," he said, his voice low and cold. "And after the attack, you've become a target. You know too much. You've seen too much. They won't let you live." Ezra swallowed hard. "Then why not simply protect me? Why do we have to get married?" "Because in this world, my husband is protected by my entire organization." Damien set the whiskey down and stepped toward him. "No one dares lay a hand on the Iron Wolf's husband. But an Omega Maid." He shook his head. "A Maid is disposable. He can be removed at any time." Ezra felt his throat go dry. "What else?" Damien looked at him, and something in his eyes softened just a little. "Your sister, Amelia. She'll be brought to New York, enrolled in the best private school, with security 24/7. No one will be able to touch her." Ezra's chest tightened at the sound of Amelia's name. His little sister, the child he'd sacrificed everything to raise, was back in West Virginia alone, completely unprotected. If the people behind the attack found Amelia, Ezra couldn't even force his mind to go further. In return, Damien continued, "You'll play the role of my husband in public. Attend events, parties, live in this mansion as Mr. Volkov, and keep caring for Mateo." He paused, emphasizing each word. "This is a contract marriage. No physical obligation. It ends when I find the traitor and eliminate the threat." Ezra was silent for a long time, his thoughts spinning. Finally, he lifted his chin, his gaze hardening. "I'm not anyone's chess piece," he said, his voice clear and final. "I've lived my whole life like a piece on a board, move wherever life wanted. I don't want to become your piece, no matter the reason." Damien stepped closer, gray eyes locked on his, intense and unshakable. "You saved my son with your life," he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "This isn't repayment. This is me protecting what belongs to me now." "What belongs to you?" Ezra wanted to ask, wanted to understand what he meant. But he didn't get the chance. The phone in his pocket vibrated, an unknown number. He glanced at Damien for permission, then opened a message. The blood in his veins froze solid. It was a photo. Amelia, his sister, walking to school with her backpack on, completely unaware that someone was watching her from across the street. And beneath the photo was a single line of text. "Such a pretty little sister. It'd be a shame if something happened to her." Ezra looked up, his face drained, his hand trembling around the phone. His eyes met Damien's, and he knew the Alpha understood. "When do we sign?" The wedding took place 3 days later. Not in a grand church or a luxurious hotel, but in a small room at the New York City courthouse. There was no white gown, no fresh flowers, no Mendelssohn, no pealing bells. Just Ezra in a simple cream suit, Damien in his usual black one, Marco standing as a witness with an unreadable face, and Mrs. Rosa wiping away tears in the corner for reasons she couldn't explain. The ceremony ended in less than 15 minutes. Ezra signed the marriage license, his hand trembling slightly as the pen moved across the paper. Then Damien took his hand and slipped a diamond ring onto his left ring finger, the stone so large it felt heavy, as if he were wearing an entire new world on his hand. And just like that, Ezra Blackwood became Ezra Volkov. The next 2 weeks were a relentless whirlwind of change. The dull black maid's uniform was replaced by designer clothes, Valentino suits, Armani jackets, shoes that cost more than an entire year of his former wages. An image consultant was hired to teach him how to move like a society husband, how to speak at parties, how to smile without revealing what he truly felt. Marco spent hours every day explaining New York's underworld to him, the name of every Mafia family, the tangled web of their relationships, who was an ally, who was an enemy, who could be trusted and who required caution. Ezra memorized everything as if studying for an exam, because he understood that one small mistake in this world could be paid for with his life. Amelia was brought to New York exactly as Damien promised. She was placed in a prestigious private school on the Upper East Side with a security team on her 24/7, shadowing her every step. When she saw her brother again, Amelia cried and asked what was happening. Ezra only held her and said everything would be okay, that at last their lives were changing. He didn't tell her the truth. He didn't speak of bullets, of a contract marriage, of an underworld drenched in blood and secrets. Amelia didn't need to know. Amelia only needed to be safe. Ezra's first public appearance as Mr. Volkov was at an elite underworld party held in a luxury penthouse overlooking Central Park. He entered at Damien's side, one hand resting on his alpha's arm, exactly as the image consultant had taught him. A long black suit fitted to his figure, the diamond on his finger catching the light beneath crystal chandeliers. The room's reaction moved like a spreading wave. First silence, then a rising murmur of whispers. The Omega Maid? You're kidding. He's wearing Volkov's ring. Ezra felt hundreds of eyes stabbing into him like knives, filled with curiosity, doubt, and contempt. But he kept his back straight, his chin high, and his expression calm, exactly as he'd been trained. Midway through the party, a middle-aged man in a pinstripe suit with a practiced smile approached them. He was one of the capos of the Ricci family, and he was clearly displeased by Ezra's presence. Mr. Volkov, he said, his tone sweet as honey but threaded with venom. Tell me, what do you bring to this marriage other than housekeeping skills? The room fell silent, everyone waiting to see how Ezra would respond. He felt Damien's hand tighten slightly at his waist, a gentle warning. But Ezra didn't need anyone to protect him in this fight. He looked the man straight in the eyes, his lips curving into a small smile. I bring something none of you have, he said, his voice clear and carrying through the quiet space. The ability to take 3 bullets and still stand. Can you do the same? The room went dead still. The man opened his mouth, then closed it with no idea what to say. From a far corner, Ezra heard the sharp sound of glass cracking. He glanced over and saw Valentine Blackwell standing there, his face drained with rage. The champagne flute in his hand fractured under the pressure of his fingers clenched tight. And beside Ezra, Damien did something that made the entire room freeze. His lips lifted just slightly, almost too subtle to notice, but it was a smile. The first smile anyone had seen on the Iron Wolf's face in 3 years. And Ezra realized he was playing a far more dangerous game than he'd ever imagined. After the party that night, life inside the Volkov mansion slipped into a new rhythm, tight with tension. To mislead the household staff and make sure no one suspected the true nature of the marriage, Damien and Ezra were forced to share the master bedroom. The room was enormous, with a king-size bed, deep red velvet curtains, and tall windows overlooking the garden. But the air inside always felt heavy with something no one dared to name. Damien insisted on sleeping on the leather sofa in the corner, leaving the bed to Ezra, and he wouldn't accept a single protest. This is our agreement, he said coldly. No physical obligation. I keep my word. But the forced closeness of sharing the same space created a strain they both felt, and neither of them admitted. On the first night, Ezra stood at the mirror changing into his sleepwear, thinking Damien had gone out to the balcony as usual. He unzipped his shirt and let it slide off his shoulders. And in that exact moment, his eyes caught Damien's gray gaze in the mirror. The alpha was standing in the bathroom doorway, and he was looking at him, not a passing glance, but a fixed, intense stare. His gray eyes darkened like a sky before a storm, and Ezra caught the faintest shift in the air, the scent of cedar and smoke, Damien's alpha pheromones, sharp and unmistakable. Ezra's heart stumbled, his breath catching in his throat. Then Damien turned away abruptly, walked out to the balcony fast, and didn't come back until Ezra was in bed with the covers pulled up to his chin. On the third night, Ezra woke at 3 a.m. to the wind screaming outside the windows. He sat up, and his heart seemed to stop for a beat. Damien was standing by the window, barebacked, moonlight pouring over his skin and revealing scars crisscrossing him like a map of violence. Long scars running from shoulder to lower back, round scars from bullets, jagged scars from knives. Every scar was a story, a battle, a near death. Ezra watched him, and for the first time he understood, Damien Volkov wasn't an invincible monster. He was a man of flesh and bone who had bled, who had hurt, who carried wounds that might never truly heal. The alpha's scent was thick in the air, cedar, smoke, and something darker, something that made Ezra's omega instinct stir in a way he didn't want to acknowledge. Damien turned and caught him watching. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Damien's jaw tightened, and he said nothing, only returned to the sofa, lay down, and turned his back to Ezra. But the scent lingered, and Ezra couldn't fall back asleep. The next afternoon, Ezra was sitting in the living room, reading to Mateo when Damien walked in. The 6-year-old looked up, his face bright, and blurted out in the most natural way, "Dad, can you read me the story about the prince?" The whole room seemed to freeze. Ezra stopped breathing, the book slipping from his hands. Damien stood in the middle of the room, his body rigid as stone, gray eyes fixed on his son with something unreadable, pain, hope, fear, or all of it at once. Ezra looked at him, not knowing what to say, not knowing whether he should correct Mateo or not. The boy glanced between his Omega caretaker and his father, innocent, not understanding why the adults had gone so strangely quiet. Finally, Damien only gave a single nod, so small it was almost invisible, then turned and walked away. But before he left the room, Ezra saw him lift a hand and touch the left side of his chest, where his heart beat, as if he were trying to hold something back that was rising inside him. That night, Ezra had a nightmare. He saw the old house in West Virginia again. Saw that horrible night again. The sound of fists and boots, the snap of bones, the savage laughter of the lone sharks, and his father's blood spreading across the rotten wooden floor. He cried in his sleep, calling his father's name, begging him not to die, begging someone to save him. Then a hand touched his. Warm, steady, safe. Ezra opened his eyes and saw Damien sitting beside the bed in the darkness, not saying a word. He was only holding his hand, fingers laced with his, and he stayed there in silence like a guard in the night. Ezra didn't know how long he'd been there, didn't know what he'd heard him sob into his sleep. He only knew his alpha's presence drove the nightmare back, and he slowly slipped into a dreamless sleep, his hand still gripping Damien's. But something else lingered in the air. Damien's scent was stronger now, laced with something protective, something almost possessive. And Ezra felt his own omega pheromones responding in kind, a quiet warmth blooming in his chest that he couldn't control and didn't fully understand. He fell asleep still holding Damien's hand, his body instinctively leaning toward the alpha's warmth. The next morning, neither of them mentioned what happened in the night. Damien was back on the sofa before Ezra woke, and he treated him as if nothing had happened. But his hand had been warm, his scent had been protective, and Ezra couldn't forget it. 2 weeks after the night Damien held his hand through the nightmare, a charity gala was held at the Plaza Hotel. It was the first time they appeared before New York's upper crust as husband and husband. Ezra stood before the mirror in the dressing room and barely recognized the man staring back at him. The long black Italian silk suit clung to his body as if it had been stitched directly onto him, the back cut daringly low yet still elegant, the jacket flaring softly like water with every step he took. His hair was swept into a high style, revealing the graceful line of his neck, and a pair of diamond earrings that Damien had placed in his hand that morning without a word. The full set included a necklace and bracelet as well, each diamond so pure Ezra didn't dare think about what it cost. When he stepped out, Damien was waiting at the foot of the stairs. Ezra had to steady himself so he didn't trip. The Alpha wore a perfectly tailored black suit, a white shirt sharp against his sun-kissed skin, a black silk tie, and his dark hair slicked back with clean precision. He was beautiful enough to steal breath, dangerous enough to kill. His gray eyes swept Ezra from head to toe, and though his face remained blank, Ezra could have sworn he saw his pupils widen for a split second. The air between them shifted, Damien's sense spiking with something dark and hungry before he reined it in. "You look acceptable," he said evenly. Ezra almost laughed. Acceptable. Of course. The plaza that night glittered like a palace out of a fairy tale. Enormous crystal chandeliers, fresh flowers flown in from the Netherlands, and 200 guests from the highest tiers of New York society. Ezra entered at Damien's side, his hand resting on his Alpha's arm, and he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward them. Whispers rippled like waves, but this time they weren't laced with contempt or doubt. People looked at him with curiosity, even with a kind of respect. The Omega who took 3 bullets for Volkov's son. The Omega who became Mr. Volkov. His story had become legend in the underworld, and tonight he was the center of it all. In the middle of the evening, Damien was invited onto the stage to speak as the principal sponsor. He stepped up tall and commanding beneath the spotlight, and when he took the microphone, the entire ballroom fell silent. "I'm not good at talking about feelings," he began, his deep voice carrying through the room. "Truth is, for many years, I wasn't sure I even had any left to talk about." Soft laughter moved through the crowd. "But my husband taught me there are things more valuable than power, more worth holding than an empire." Damien's gaze found Ezra in the crowd and stopped there, refusing to move. "He holds my heart, whatever is left of it." The audience applauded, laughter and whistles rising. But Ezra didn't hear any of it. All he could see were Damien's gray eyes fixed on him across the packed room, and his own heart beating so wildly it felt like it might break out of his chest. He knew it was an act. He knew it was all a performance carefully staged. So why wouldn't his heart understand that? After the speech, Ezra slipped out to the balcony to escape the curious questions and the probing stares. He leaned on the railing, looking out at the New York night, 1,000 lights glittering like falling stars, and drew a long breath of cold air. Footsteps behind him made him turn. Damien stepped out, loosening his tie with a tired motion, and stopped beside him. "You played your part well," he said, eyes on the skyline. Ezra smiled faintly. "So did you." I almost believed it. Silence settled over them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, charged, like the air before a storm. Ezra felt the warmth of Damien's body beside his, the faint scent of sandalwood and whiskey carried on the night wind. His Alpha's pheromones mingled with his own, and for a moment, the line between performance and reality blurred. Then Damien moved closer. Close enough that Ezra could count the few rare strands of silver at his temple. Close enough that their breaths almost touched. "If I kiss you right now," Damien said, his voice dropping into a whisper, "would that be acting?" Ezra's heart slammed. Heat rushed into his face, but he didn't step back. He lifted his chin, hazel eyes meeting gray, and answered in a trembling voice he couldn't control. "I don't know." "Try it." Damien didn't need to be invited twice. He bent down, and his lips met Ezra's, gentle at first, as if asking permission, as if testing whether he would push him away. Ezra didn't. Instead, he kissed him back, and the kiss caught fire. Damien's arm wrapped around his waist and pulled him tight against his chest, and Ezra gripped the lapel of his suit as if he was afraid he'd fall. The kiss tasted like whiskey and desperation, as if they'd both been waiting too long for this moment and couldn't hold it back any longer. Then a gunshot cracked from below. Screams erupted in the ballroom. Damien yanked Ezra down onto the balcony floor, his body shielding his omegas, the tender moment shattering in an instant. "They found us." The Plaza Hotel plunged into chaos. Gunfire erupted again and again. Panicked screams tore through the air. Glass shattered. Tables and chairs slammed to the floor as 200 well-dressed guests crushed toward the exits. The attackers in black had forced their way into the ballroom, and Damien's security team was in a brutal firefight to hold them back. Damien hauled Ezra to his feet, one arm locked tight around his waist, the other pulling a gun from inside his suit jacket, and he dragged him toward a service stairwell. Marco stayed close behind, his pistol barking with precise shots at any shadow bold enough to come near. "Where's Mateo?" Ezra shouted over the roar. In the car safe, Damien answered, his voice taut. "We have to get out of here." They thundered down the stairs, cut through the service corridor, and burst out the rear exit where the convoy was waiting. But the moment the first car pulled away from the hotel, gunfire cracked again. An ambush. The convoy was ambushed right on the streets of New York in the dead of night. Damien shoved Ezra down onto the floor of the car, his body shielding his omegas, while the driver fought to accelerate out of the trap. But through the noise and chaos, Ezra looked through the window, and his heart seemed to stop. The car behind him, the car carrying Mateo, was being approached by an assassin. The man raised his gun and aimed straight at the glass where Ezra could see the terrified face of the 6-year-old boy curled into the corner of the seat. Ezra didn't think. He flung the door open and lunged out despite Damien's shout, sprinted toward the car behind him, yanked the door wide, and threw his body over Mateo at the exact moment the assassin pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed his arm, tearing skin and leaving a bright red streak that spread across the sleeve of his black suit. Pain ripped through his arm, but Ezra didn't let go of Mateo. He wrapped him tight, shielding him with his body, and waited for the next shot. But that bullet never came. Instead, he heard a sound like an animal growl, and when he looked up, he saw Damien. He didn't shoot the last 2 assassins. He beat them with his bare hands. Each punch fell like a sledgehammer, bones snapping, blood spraying, and Damien's face was utterly blank. No anger, no hatred. Only the cold emptiness of a killer without emotion. Marco stood a few meters away, not intervening, but Ezra saw his hand trembling around the gun. In 15 years serving Damien Volkov, Marco had seen his boss furious many times. But fury wasn't as frightening as what he was witnessing now. The emptiness, the complete loss of control hiding behind a calm mask. That was what truly terrified Marco. They returned to the mansion in silence. Mateo had fallen asleep in Mrs. Rose's arms, exhausted after the terror. Ezra was taken to the master bedroom, where a doctor was already waiting to treat his wound. But Damien sent him away. "I'll do it," he said, a voice that didn't accept argument. "Let me do it." He sat beside Ezra with gauze and antiseptic in his hands and began wiping the blood from his arm. His touch was shockingly gentle, the exact opposite of the brutality he'd just shown not long ago. The air between them was thick with the scent of Damien's alpha pheromones, cedar and smoke, laced with something raw and protective. Ezra's own omega instincts responded, a quiet warmth flooding through him despite the pain. Silence stretched heavy and taut until Damien finally spoke, his voice rough as if every word hurt. "Don't ever do that again." He didn't look at him, his eyes still fixed on the wound. "Don't ever bleed for my family again." Ezra looked at him, at the rigid set of his shoulders, at his jaw clenched tight, and he understood. Damien wasn't angry because he'd been reckless. He was afraid. Afraid because he'd almost lost him. "They're my family now," Ezra said, his voice soft but certain. Damien looked up, gray eyes meeting hazel, and something in his gaze shifted forever, like the last wall collapsing, like a door sealed shut for years finally cracking open. His scent changed too, deepening with something raw and vulnerable that made Ezra's omega instincts purr with satisfaction. "Sergei used to say that too," Damien whispered, pain cutting through his voice like a knife. "He was killed because of me. My enemies wanted to bring me down, so they targeted the one I loved. And I wasn't there to protect him. I can't survive if that happens again. Not with you." Ezra lifted his hand and touched Damien's face, the same gesture he'd made when he was dying on that blood-soaked floor weeks ago. I'm not Sergey. I survived West Virginia. I survived 3 bullets. I'll survive your world. For the first time, Damien had no answer. He only leaned into Ezra's touch, his eyes closing, and for a moment, the Iron Wolf looked almost fragile. In the days after the attack at the Plaza Hotel, Ezra couldn't stop thinking. 2 attacks in a short span of time, both aimed at Mateo, and the traitor inside the organization still hadn't shown their face. Damien and Marco were investigating in their way, but Ezra had an advantage they didn't. He was invisible in the eyes of high society, and people often said things they shouldn't in front of an Omega. He went to Mrs. Rosa, the elderly housekeeper who'd witnessed every rise and fall of the Volkov family for 30 years. Mrs. Rosa had an old connection with a servant in the Benedetti household, a man named Mario who'd served on Carlo's family since he was young. Through Mario, the pieces began to appear. Valentine Blackwell had met his father, Don Carlo, many times in secret over the past 6 months. Not ordinary father-son visits, but closed-door meetings in a locked office that lasted for hours, voices lowered so far that even the servants couldn't hear. Ezra asked Marco for help, and he hacked an old phone belonging to one of Don Carlo's trusted men. In the pile of deleted messages, they found conversations between Valentine and his father, clearing the path. The phrase appeared again and again, and Ezra felt a chill crawl up his spine as he read it. But the discovery that truly made him shudder came from another direction. Digging deeper into the past, Ezra stumbled onto the file about Sergei's death. Damien's late husband. The crash happened 3 years ago on a lonely mountain road. Sergei's car was hit off the cliff edge and plunged into the ravine below. Police concluded it was an accident, a loss of control. But there was a single witness who claimed he'd seen another vehicle strike Sergei's car from behind. That witness vanished right after giving his statement, and no one ever found him again. It took Marco 2 days to trace the trail. And when he finally did, Ezra felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. The witness had received a large payment from an anonymous bank account, and that account was linked to a shell company owned by none other than Valentine Blackwell. Valentine had killed Sergei. Suddenly, everything snapped into focus clear as daylight. 5 years ago, Valentine had been engaged to Damien in an arranged marriage between 2 powerful Mafia families. He loved Damien since he was 16, obsessed with him, convinced they were fate. Then Damien met Sergei, an ordinary Omega outside the underworld, and he loved him at first sight. He broke the engagement with Valentine, despite opposition from both families, and married Sergei. Valentine never forgave him. He waited. He planned. And 3 years after the wedding, he acted. Now, history was repeating itself. Ezra had taken Sergei's place, and Valentine wouldn't stop until he was erased too. Ezra carried all the evidence into Damien's office late at night. The Alpha was sitting behind his desk with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and when Ezra placed the stack of documents in front of him, he watched his face change as he read page after page. First skepticism, then shock, and finally something Ezra had never seen on the Iron Wolf's face: fracture. The whiskey slipped from his hand and shattered on a floor, but Damien didn't seem to notice. He just sat there staring at the proof, and Ezra saw his broad shoulders start to tremble. For the first time, he didn't see the powerful Mafia boss. He didn't see New York's terrifying Iron Wolf. He saw a man betrayed by someone he'd once trusted, a man who'd lost the husband he loved to another person's mad jealousy. He killed Sergei. Damien's voice came out rough and barely human. And now he's coming for you. For Mateo. He lifted his head, and those gray eyes had turned into cold steel. Tonight we end this. Right after the night the truth about Valentine came to light, Damien called an emergency meeting with Marco and his most loyal capos. A plan was built in the span of a few hours. They would host a 1-month wedding anniversary party at the Volkov mansion and invite every powerful family in New York's underworld, including Valentine and Don Carlo Benedetti. It would be the perfect trap. In front of more than 100 witnesses from the Mafia families, Damien would present the evidence of Valentine's crimes, that he had killed Sergei and plotted to assassinate Mateo. In the underworld, murdering a boss's husband and child was an unforgivable sin, and Valentine and his father would be forced to face the judgment of every family. Weapons were prepared. Men were placed at every corner of the mansion. The script was mapped minute by minute. Ezra would stand beside Damien when he revealed the truth, and Marco would lead the security team to make sure no one could get out. Everything was ready for the party the following night. But Valentine struck first. That afternoon, as Ezra was in his room getting his suit and everything else ready for the evening, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number with a video attached. Ezra opened it, and his heart seemed to stop. Amelia, his sister, was tied to a wooden chair in a dark, damp room, her eyes covered with black cloth, tears running down her cheeks. The girl was crying, her shoulders shaking in waves, and Ezra could hear the thin, broken sobs through the phone screen. Then a voice came through, ice cold and sweet as venom. "Come to the old warehouse at Pier 17. Alone. You have 1 hour. Tell anyone, and your sister will die slowly." The blood in Ezra's veins turned to ice. He watched the video again and again, watching Amelia cry, and it felt like someone was crushing his heart in their fist. He knew he should tell Damien. He knew it could be a trap. But 1 hour, there wasn't enough time to plan, to move people, to do anything at all. And if Valentine saw anyone with him, if he knew Ezra had broken the promise, Amelia would die. His sister would die because of him. Ezra stood there, his hand trembling around the phone, and he made his choice. He slid the diamond wedding ring off his finger, set it on the vanity, and wrote a short line on a sticky note. "I'm sorry. I have to do this." He didn't look back. He slipped out of the room, took the service stairway he'd learned during his months as a maid, avoided every security camera and guard, and disappeared into the New York night. His heart hammered like a war drum, but in his mind there was only one thought: Amelia. He had to save her, no matter the cost. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Rosa entered the room to check whether Ezra was ready. She saw the glittering ring on the vanity, the note beside it, and the empty room. Damien's roar shook the entire mansion when she handed him the note. "Find him right now." Marco was already running for the front doors before Damien could finish the sentence. "I put a tracker in his phone, sir. I know where he's going." The abandoned warehouse on Pier 17 sat at the edge of the city, with a smell of sea salt mixed with rust and the slow rot of time. Ezra had the taxi drop him a block away and walked the rest, his heart beating like a war drum, each step echoing on cracked concrete. He pushed the rusted iron door, the squeal ripping through the silence, and stepped into the dark. Inside, the warehouse was cold and damp, lit by the weak glow of a few bulbs dangling from the high ceiling, casting patches of light and shadow like a stage set for tragedy. In the far corner of the vast space, Ezra saw Amelia. His sister was tied to a wooden chair, her hands cuffed behind her back, her eyes still blindfolded, her body trembling in shuddering waves. When she heard Ezra's footsteps, Amelia lifted her head, her voice raw from too much crying. "Ezra? Is that you?" "It's me, Amelia." Ezra wanted to run to her, but the survival instinct he'd learned in West Virginia made him stop. He knew this was a trap. He knew he wasn't alone in this warehouse. Laughter rose from the shadows, cold and delighted. Valentine Blackwell stepped out like a venomous snake sliding from its den. He wore a suit as red as blood, stark against his pallid skin, his black hair loose over his shoulders, and in his hand was a pistol aimed straight at Ezra. 4 men dressed in black emerged from the dark corners, surrounding Ezra from every side, cutting off every escape. "You really came." Valentine smiled, but it never reached his ice-cold eyes. "I thought you'd run to Damien and beg for help. But no, you came alone for this poor little sister of yours." "How touching." Ezra stood tall, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Let Amelia go." "You want me?" "I'm here. She has nothing to do with this." Valentine laughed, the sound echoing through the empty space. "Nothing to do with it. She's your weakness. Just like your Damien's weakness. Just like Sergei was his weakness." He stepped closer, the gun still leveled at Ezra's chest, his crazed eyes shining under the dim light. Do you have any idea how long I've waited for this? How long I've planned? I've loved Damien since I was 16. I spent my whole life preparing to be his husband, to stand at his side, to rule this empire with him. We were destiny. Valentine stopped, his face twisting under the pressure of boiling rage. And then Sergei appeared. A normal Omega. Nothing special. No power, no family name. And Damien chose him. He broke his engagement to me, smeared my honor in front of both families, all for some nobody. He stole what was mine. His voice dropped, cold and poisonous. So I took it back. I arranged that accident. I hired someone to ram his car off the cliff. And I watched on camera as his car went over the edge, spinning in the air, then exploding. He paused and closed his eyes as if savoring it again. It was the best day of my life. Ezra felt sick, but he didn't let it show. He looked straight into Valentine's eyes, unblinking, unshaken. And now you show up. Valentine opened his eyes, his stare burning. Another nobody. An Omega. You think you deserve him? You think you can take my place? He never loved you, Valentine, Ezra said, his voice strangely calm. Not 5 years ago. Not now. That's what you can't stand, isn't it? It's not that he chose Sergei or me. It's that he never chose you. Valentine's face warped with fury. He lunged forward, pressing the gun barrel against Ezra's temple, his hands shaking with rage he couldn't control. I want to kill you, he hissed through his teeth. Then I'll kill that poor little sister. And when Damien comes for revenge, I'll kill him too. We'll die together. Romantic, isn't it? Ezra felt the cold metal against his skin, and he started to cry, begging, his voice shaking, Please don't hurt Amelia. I'll do anything. Please. Valentine smiled in triumph, savoring his enemy's weakness. But he didn't realize Ezra was buying time. Ezra's eyes flicked toward the back door, where he'd just seen a shadow move, where he just felt something familiar in the air. The scent of sandalwood and whiskey. His alpha was here. A gunshot tore through the air, but it didn't come from Valentine's pistol. One of the 4 men dropped to the floor, blood spraying from the hole in his forehead. Then 2 more. Then the last. Each shot precise and lethal. Damien stepped through the smoke, the gun in his hand still steaming, his gray eyes burning with cold fire. You should have run while you still could, Valentine. The warehouse erupted into a battlefield in an instant. Marco appeared at the back door, his gun in his hand spitting non-stop fire at the men Valentine still had hidden in the shadows. Shots thundered through the space, bullets tearing the air, screams breaking open, bodies slamming onto the cold concrete floor. Damien moved like a lethal ghost, every shot finding its mark with terrifying precision. His alpha pheromones flooded the space, cedar, smoke, and pure rage, and Ezra felt his own Omega instincts responding, a surge of warmth and strength that pushed him forward. In the middle of the chaos, Ezra moved. He ran for Amelia, slipping on a floor slick with blood, but he didn't stop. A shard of broken glass lay near his foot, and he snatched it up, ignoring the sharp edge biting into his palm. His blood dripped as he sawed through the rope around Amelia's wrists, but he didn't feel pain. He felt only the fierce need to pull his sister out of this hell. Amelia collapsed into his arms, sobbing, shaking out of control. Ezra hauled her up, slung her arm over his shoulder, and started dragging her toward the emergency exit in the far corner of the warehouse. Just a few meters more. Just a few more steps, and they'd be safe. But Valentine wouldn't lose. While Damien and Marco were occupied with the gunman, he used the confusion to slip free of the fight. Ezra heard footsteps behind him, turned, and the blood in his body turned to ice. Valentine was running straight at him, black hair wild, red suit smeared with dirt, the gun in his hand aimed at Ezra's chest. His eyes were crazed, like an animal cornered with nothing left to lose. You think you can take him from me? Valentine screamed, his voice sharp with madness. No one takes anything from me. He pulled the trigger. Everything happened in an instant, yet in Ezra's eyes, It moved in slow motion. He saw Valentine's finger tighten, saw the flash at the muzzle, saw the bullet racing toward him. Then something slammed into Ezra from the side, hard enough to throw him, and the gunshot cracked at the same moment. A man's grunt of pain tore through the air. Damien. He'd hurled himself between Ezra and the bullet, knocking him down, and the bullet tore through his shoulder instead of his chest. He fell beside Ezra, bright red blood soaking through his black suit, spreading like dead petals across his chest. Another shot rang out, and Valentine screamed, collapsing as Marco's bullet tore through his leg. He shrieked and thrashed, but he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. Ezra crawled to Damien, cradling his alpha's head, tears spilling with no control. "You idiot!" he screamed, his voice breaking with fear and pain. "Why did you do that?" Damien looked up at him, and despite the bleeding wound, despite the pain that had to be ripping through him, his mouth still curved into a weak smile. Blood stained his teeth when he spoke, his voice rough. "Now we're even, little sparrow." Ezra cried, truly cried for the first time since the night he watched his father die on that porch in West Virginia. The tears he'd held back for years burst like a dam, breaking, falling onto Damien's face as it grew paler by the second. "Don't you dare die in front of me, Damien Volkov," he said through sobs. "I won't forgive you if you die." Damien let out a soft laugh that turned into a painful cough. "Not a chance," he whispered. "You'd find a way down to hell just to yell at me." Marco ran over, phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight as he called for an ambulance and a medical team. Then another voice came through on speaker, a child's voice crying hard. "Is Dad okay? Is Mr. Ezra okay? I want my dads to come home." Ezra's heart shattered at the sound of Mateo. Damien heard it too, and something in his eyes softened. "Tell him," he whispered. "Daddy and Papa are coming home." Across the warehouse, Amelia stood braced against a wall, trembling, eyes wide as she stared at the scene in front of her in stunned disbelief. When things finally settled, when Valentine was cuffed and dragged away, when the medics began treating Damien, Amelia looked at her brother and asked, her voice shaking, "Ezra, who was that man?" Ezra looked down at Damien, at the blood, the pain, and the way he still tried to smile at him. "My husband." For the first time, the word didn't feel like a lie. 3 days after the horror at the Pier 17 warehouse, the 1-month wedding anniversary party still went forward exactly as planned. The Volkov mansion was dressed in splendor, crystal chandeliers casting warm light across the vast hall, fresh flowers from all over the world arranged in expensive crystal vases, and more than 100 of the highest-ranking figures in New York's underworld gathered in full force. Damien stood at the head of the room, his shoulder bandaged beneath a perfectly tailored black suit, his back straight as steel, his face giving away not a trace of pain. He was still the Iron Wolf, still the terrifying alpha all of New York feared, and the wound on his shoulder only made him look more dangerous. Ezra stood beside him in a suit as red as blood, as red as victory. The suit clung to his body, revealing curves he used to hide beneath a maid's uniform. His brown hair was swept up in a regal style, and the diamond on his left ring finger glittered under the chandeliers. He wasn't the timid Omega from West Virginia anymore. He was Mr. Volkov, and tonight he would prove it. Don Carlo Benedetti arrived late, as if he wanted to make an entrance. He walked into the hall with the confidence of a powerful alpha boss. A greasy smile spread across his heavy face, completely unaware that his son was being held in the basement of this very mansion. He approached Damien with arms wide, as if greeting an old friend. "Damien, my boy, congratulations on your marriage. I hope there's no lingering trouble over old business between us." Damien stared at him, gray eyes cold as ice, and didn't answer. Instead, he stepped onto the small platform in the center of the room and lifted a hand for silence. "Thank you all for coming tonight," his voice carried through the hall, deep and commanding. "But before we celebrate, there are a few things I need to share with you." The large screen behind him lit up, and the video began to play. Valentine's voice filled the room, clear in the silence, confessing every detail of how he had arranged the crash that killed Sergei, of the secret meetings with Don Carlo to plan Mateo's assassination, of the mad jealousy that had driven every step he took. "This is the recording from the warehouse," Damien said, his voice ice cold. "From the mouth of my husband's killer himself. Valentine Blackwell, son of Don Carlo Benedetti, killed Sergei Volkov 3 years ago. And recently, he and his father plotted to assassinate my son, Matteo." The hall erupted into murmurs, whispers spreading everywhere. Don Carlo went pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but he still tried to smile. "This is a lie," he shouted, his voice shaking. "You can't believe this. This is a smear campaign." Then he did something no one expected. He drew a concealed gun and aimed it straight at Damien, eyes red with rage and desperation. "You think you can take everything from me? My son, my empire? I'll kill you first." But before he could pull the trigger, 20 guns swung toward him from every direction. Damien's men were positioned all around the room, and there was nowhere to run. The weapon was ripped from his hand, and Don Carlo was forced down onto his knees, his face pressed into the expensive red carpet. Then a side door opened, and Valentine was brought in. He looked ruined, no longer the proud beauty in an expensive red suit Ezra had once seen. His black hair was a mess, his face hollow from sleeplessness, and the eyes that used to be ice cold were now full of fear and despair. He saw Damien, and despite everything, he still screamed, "Damien, please. I did it all for you. I love you." Damien looked at him without a flicker of mercy. "You killed my husband. You tried to kill the father of my son. That isn't love. That's sick obsession." Valentine sobbed and dropped to his knees. "You won't kill me. You don't kill Omegas. You know me." Damien watched him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. I don't kill Omegas." Then he turned to Ezra, and every eye in the room swung to him. "But my husband can." The hall held its breath. Ezra stepped forward and stood before Valentine, kneeling on the floor, looking down at the man who had threatened him, who had tried to kill his sister, who had nearly taken his life more than once. Valentine looked up, eyes swimming with tears, waiting for judgment. "No," Ezra said, his voice clear and carrying. Hope flickered in Valentine's eyes. But Ezra wasn't finished. "He isn't worth staining my hands with blood. Let him rot in prison. Let him live out the rest of his life in misery, knowing he's lost everything, knowing Damien never loved him, knowing I won." Valentine screamed, the sound ripping through the air, raw with pain and madness. He fought as he was dragged away, hurling curses no one cared to hear. The door closed, and silence fell over the room. Damien turned to Ezra and looked at him, truly looked at him, the way he had the first time in the mansion hallway months ago. The air between them crackled with pheromones, Damien's cedar ant smoke sent flooding the space, Ezra's own Omega sweetness responding in kind. "This is why you're my husband," Damien said, his voice low and rough, laced with something that made Ezra's knees weak. "This is why I love you." For the first time, Ezra believed it. A week had passed since the night of that fateful party, and for the first time in months, the Volkov mansion was wrapped in peace. Late afternoon sunlight slipped through the velvet curtains, spilling warm gold across the rooms, and Matteo's laughter drifted in from the garden where he was playing with Mrs. Rosa. No more gunfire. No more blood. No more fear stalking the shadows. Valentine Blackwell had been transferred to a federal prison, facing a life sentence for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He would never see the sunlight of freedom again, and it was the punishment he deserved for what he'd done. Don Carlo Benedetti, meanwhile, had been stripped of all power in a closed meeting of the families. His territory was divided among the others, his assets seized, and he himself was sent off to some remote place no one knew and no one cared to know. He would live out the rest of his life in oblivion, and that was more painful than death. That afternoon, Amelia came to visit Ezra. She'd recovered from the shock of the warehouse, but there was still something haunted in her eyes, something permanently changed after seeing the real world her brother lived in. Amelia sat down beside Ezra on the sofa in a luxurious living room, her eyes red as if she'd been crying. "I never said thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You almost died for me." Ezra took his sister's hand and squeezed it tight. "You're my sister. I'd do it 1,000 times if I had to. Amelia was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting around the grand mansion, the expensive paintings, the lavish furniture, the completely different life her brother was living. This life, this world. It scares me, Ezra, she admitted. But then she lifted her head, looked into his eyes, and a small smile formed. But you look happy. Happier than I've ever seen you. Ezra looked at his sister and realized she was right. I think I really am happy. Amelia hugged him, arms tight, and whispered into his ear, Then I'm happy too. Just don't get shot again, okay? Ezra laughed, the first truly relieved laugh he'd had in months, and held his sister close. That night, Damien called Ezra to his office. He stepped into the familiar room, scented with oak and whiskey, the place where everything had started not long ago with an offer of a contract marriage. Damien was sitting behind a desk, but when Ezra entered, he stood, opened a drawer, and took out a stack of papers, their marriage contract. Ezra looked at him, not understanding what he was doing, until Damien took the contract and tore it in half right in front of him. The pieces fluttered to the floor like snow, and Ezra stared at them with his heart pounding. The contract is over, Damien said, his voice low and steady. The traitor's been dealt with. You're free. Ezra looked at the torn pieces on the floor, then lifted his eyes to him. What if I don't want to be free? Damien stepped closer, gray eyes never leaving his for even a second. Then what do you want? Ezra met his gaze, his omega instincts purring with satisfaction at the alpha's proximity. What if I want to stay? Silence filled the room, heavy and taut, nothing but the sound of their hearts beating in the space between them. The air thickened with pheromones, cedar and smoke mingling with Ezra's own sweet omega scent, wrapping around them like a promise. Then Damien reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. He opened it, and inside was another diamond ring, not the contract ring Ezra had worn all this time, but one smaller, more delicate, yet brighter than anything he'd ever seen. And Damien Volkov, the most feared alpha mafia boss in New York, the Iron Wolf the entire city trembled before, dropped to one knee in front of him. Then let me do this the right way, he said, his voice rough, thick with feelings he'd held back for far too long. No contract. No obligation. No business arrangement. Just me, a broken man with too much blood on his hands, begging the Omega who saved my son, who survived my world, who somehow made me feel again after I thought that part of me died with Sergei. I love you, Ezra. Not because you saved Mateo. Not because you're convenient. I love you because you're the strongest person I've ever met. Because you make me want to be better. Because when I look at you, I don't see a maid or a pawn or a contract. I see my home. He looked up, gray eyes shining under the lamplight, and Ezra saw something there he'd never seen before. Vulnerability, sincerity, love. Marry me for real this time. Because I love you in a way that's desperate, complete, and terrifying. Because I don't want to survive without you. Because you're mine, and I'm yours, and I want the whole damn world to know it. Ezra sank down to his level, tears streaming down his cheeks, and he smiled through the tears. Yes. And he kissed him, not acting this time. This time it was real. Damien's arms wrapped around him, pulling him close, and Ezra felt the alpha's teeth graze his neck, right over his scent gland. A shiver ran through him, his omega instinct singing with joy. Can I mark you? Damien whispered against his skin, his voice raw with barely contained desire. I need everyone to know you're mine. Ezra tilted his head back, baring his throat, his voice trembling with need. Yes, please. Mark me. Damien's teeth sank into his gland, gentle but firm, the bond snapping into place like a final lock clicking shut. Ezra gasped, pleasure flooding through him as Damien's pheromones wrapped around him like a warm blanket, claiming him, completing him. The alpha's scent merged with his own, and Ezra felt it, the bond, the connection, the forever that stretched out before them. I love you, Alpha, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I love you too, little sparrow, Damien murmured against his neck. Forever. 1 year later, The Volkov mansion was flooded with warm, golden afternoon sunlight, chasing away every shadow and every painful memory that had once haunted these halls. Ezra stood by the living room window, one hand resting gently on his 7-month belly, watching the rose garden in full bloom. He changed so much from the thin Omega in a maid's uniform back then. Now he wore a soft white shirt, his glossy brown hair falling over his shoulders, and on his face was the satisfied smile of an Omega who'd finally found where he belonged. The thunder of small feet on the wooden floor made him turn. Mateo burst into the room, 7 years old now, taller than he'd been last year, still mischievous and overflowing with energy the way he always was. "Dad, can I feel the baby kick?" he asked, big eyes bright with curiosity and excitement. Ezra laughed, bent down, and guided his son's small hand to his belly. "The baby's sleeping right now, sweetheart." Mateo waited a moment, then looked up. "Dad, you said the baby's a girl, right?" "My little sister." "That's right, your little sister." Mateo's eyes lit up like 2 stars. "I'm going to be the best big brother ever. I'll protect her from everything." Ezra kissed his son's forehead, his heart overflowing. "I know you will." There was a knock at the door, and a familiar voice floated in. "Knock, knock, your favorite sister is here for the weekend." Amelia stepped in, 18 years old, freshly finished with her first year at Columbia with excellent grades. She'd grown, she'd matured, but her mischievous smile hadn't changed. "Only sister," Ezra shot back, lips curving. "Which automatically makes you the favorite." The two of them laughed and hugged each other tight. Amelia whispered in Ezra's ear, her voice thick, "I'm so proud of you, Ezra." "Mom and Dad will be proud too." Ezra held her closer, tears rising but not falling. These were happy tears, not grief. The sound of the car engine rolled up outside, and Mateo immediately shouted, his voice bursting with excitement, "Daddy's home." The boy raced for the door like a little storm. Damien stepped through the doorway, still in his familiar black suit, still tall and commanding, but his eyes were different now. No longer the ice-cold gray eyes of the Iron Wolf. They were the eyes of a man who'd found his heart again. He bent and lifted Mateo, kissed his son's forehead, then walked into the living room. When he saw Ezra, he stopped. The Omega stood there in white, his belly round, afternoon light catching in his hair like a halo, beautiful enough to steal breath, peaceful enough to feel unreal. Damien came to him, Mateo still in one arm, the other arm sliding around his husband's waist as he pulled him into a kiss that was gentle and full of love. "I'm home," he whispered against Ezra's lips. Ezra's hand found Damien's, their bond humming with warmth and contentment. "Welcome home, Iron Wolf," he whispered back. "From 3 bullets to a family. From an invisible Omega to the husband of an empire. From a contract signed in desperation to a love written in blood and fire." Ezra Blackwood had found what he thought he'd lost forever in that ruined house in West Virginia. A place to belong, someone to belong to, and a heart brave enough to open and let him in. Some love stories begin with a kiss. Theirs began with sacrifice and ended with forever. Then